Good evening, everyone. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Stephen Hartley aho, no te kura Mataranga Kāriora. I'm, as Tim's already mentioned, from Victoria University in the School of Biological Sciences, and I'm an ecologist by training. I should tell you a bit more about myself, and that might help frame today's discussion, and I hope it will be a discussion, because I don't know if I can sit here and talk non-stop for 45 minutes. So yeah, I was brought up a Catholic in England, as you guessed, from the universities. I was even an altar server for 10 years. Came to New Zealand in 2002 with my wife Maxine and our daughter Rebecca, and after a year or so we started going to Galway Baptist Church, and I've been attending those services ever since. Yeah, not every Sunday, but yeah, well known there anyway. So I guess that's my background, or a little bit of a religious background. I was always interested in science and natural history, studied biology and physics at A-level in the UK. And yeah, I've done a variety of projects, and I guess my focus these days is ecological restoration. So trying to take degraded ecosystems and restore some of their health, either increasing their biodiversity or their ecosystem functions in terms of their ability to sequester carbon or nutrients or remove pollutants or whatever it is. And usually they can do multiple functions at once. That's the great things about diverse ecosystems. So I'll talk about it. I've got a few notes of just topics that I'm going to bring up, and some of them maybe won't flow completely one into another, but hopefully there'll be some connections that you can draw between them. And yeah, maybe we'll stop for questions and pauses along the way. So I guess one of the books that I found very interesting as a sort of late adolescent was one I read called God and the New Biology, and that introduced me to the idea of emergent properties. And before I go into that, I'll just talk about generally how science works. Often it's a reductionist activity, so you take something that's complicated and you break it down into smaller parts, and the idea is that by understanding how those parts fit together, you can then understand a bit more about the whole and how that works. And that can certainly be a very useful way of approaching things, but it has its limitations, because sometimes the complicated whole that you're trying to understand has properties that you just really can't deduce by breaking it down into its little bits, because the little bits behave in very simple ways, but you put them together, and then through their ability to interact with each other, you can get some very complex behaviours emerge from this. I mean, this has been shown in computer simulations, but also, I mean, that's how I tend to think of ecological systems. They're very complex, full of interacting organisms, species, physical environments, and we describe them with a certain language. But we don't use the language of physics and chemistry to describe a lot of biological processes and ecological processes. So I guess the opposite to reductionism is called holism. And that is that you have to sort of use a language that's appropriate to the level of complexity at which you're working. And often, yeah, I mean, someone who's a doctor, maybe who's interested in the human system, might work at the level of how organs interact with each other and treat sickness in terms of perhaps they can see disease in the tissues or something. And they may go down a level, the lower level, to maybe understand some of the chemicals that are in the blood and whether there's a high protein level or lipid levels, or they may go up to sort of a high level. I mean, and I think most people probably have an intuitive understanding that sometimes your mental health being has an effect on your physical well-being, and mental well-being is probably a much higher level concept that's emerging from the existence of our body and our minds and our psychological experiences, but it can have effects down at the lower level, but also those lower level interactions can feed up and have effects to our mental well-being and our psychology. And so, I mean, there's something called the Great Chain, and I'm taking this from a book by Ken Wilber, and I guess the idea goes is that we have psychological thoughts and feelings, and that's just a product of our minds, and our minds are based on the neurochemistry of our brains. And those brains come from sort of living organisms, but life is made up of complex carbon chemistry, and chemistry is just physics, and physics is just maths, and symbols. And so if you reduce everything down, does that just mean everything we're thinking is just a very extended version of some mathematical formulae? And if that's true, then maybe the system we're living in is too complex to fully understand because we don't know all the parts well enough and precisely enough. But one consequence of that might be a deterministic view of the universe, and that everything is following very set rules and they're all interacting in certain ways. And so if we only knew the system's conditions well enough at that fine scale level, then we would know how it was going to unfold. And so and that challenges, I guess, the concept of free will, the idea that everything is just physical laws playing out, one thing interacting with another, and even though that's capable of creating life and psychology, that concept that we have free will, maybe that's just an illusion. We think we have free will, but we don't. And then that also raises a lot of challenges for, I guess, our moral culpability for anything. And I'm going to sit on the fence for a lot of these issues and let you challenge me or challenge yourselves and each other. Yeah, I mean, just another example of an emergent property. So I've studied a species called the Argentine ants, and the question I had was, well, is it likely to spread in New Zealand and cause ecological impacts or economic harm to vineyards? And if you take the idea that sort of ecology is just the interaction of different species and living things are just chemistry and physics, you still couldn't answer that question if you were a physicist. If you understood about how atoms interacted, it wouldn't really help you answer the question of how is this species going to interact in this particular ecosystem. So you'd have to look at those more emergent properties, even accepting a completely kind of deterministic, bottom-up driven world. You still would need to describe the ecosystem using ecological terminology of whether a species is a competitor or a predator, whether it has symbiosis with other species, what its climatic limitations were, whether it's, I mean, you could delve into the physiology, whether its ability to walk is affected by temperature, and so on. So, yeah, I'll leave that one hanging there and just go on to how does science work? And I guess my understanding of the scientific method is that you develop a working hypothesis or a model of reality, and it's just a working hypothesis. It's the best that we're able to come up with at any one point in time, but you have to be prepared to be shown that that's not adequate and that there might be a better model or a better explanation. So all hypotheses are provisional and they're just working hypotheses until someone comes along with a better explanation that explains the facts even better. And so actually scientists should be trying to disprove their theories. Often they try to disprove other people's theories because scientists are human and they get wedded to their own particular kind of way of thinking, the models that they've developed, and then they cling to those models, and it's up to someone else to disprove their models. But yeah, the models keep getting updated. They might get more complex. Sometimes they get simplified, and so you can build up more and more complex models until someone realizes actually there's some quantum leap, different way of looking at it and understanding it. We can strip it back down to a much simpler approach that actually explained everything else that did seem originally quite complex. So I'll now try and sort of jump a little bit to religion. How does religion work? And I'd go back to sort of Jesus. He used a lot of parables, and he often would say things like the kingdom of God is like this, or it's like a mustard seed, or it's like a vine, or the sower. So I think to elucidate a point, he was always using models, if you like, or parables that weren't exactly how things were, but they were expressing in a way that actually people could get the point of what he was trying to say. And the same happens in science. We often use models which we know are wrong and they're approximations, but they're still useful. In fact, there's a famous quote that says, all models are wrong, just some of them happen to be useful. So I draw a parallel there between the idea of parables in the Bible as being stories that will illustrate a point, and enable people to gain a deeper understanding or more intuitive feel for what's going on. Another sort of framework which my wife introduced me to was something called Fowler's Stages of Faith. And this is that, I guess, as we mature, our understanding of religion and faith often goes through some predictable phases. As a child, you might have a very simplistic or literal view of religion, or whatever aspect of religion it is. You understand your image of God. And then it might progress to a more they've got names as primal faith and then intuitive, projective faith. The later ones, the sort of mythic, literal faith, again, tends to gravitate towards some of the stories and symbols in quite literal, concrete ways. The next stage is called synthetic or conventional faith, and again, quite strong adherence to particular beliefs and the authority of particular figures in the religious circles. And then, sort of the last few stages, stage 4 is called intuitive or reflective faith, which is often characterized by more of a questioning and a challenging and a starting to realize that religion has both cultural and political dimensions to it, and personalities and egos, as well as perhaps some of the underlying truths that have enabled it to persist. And so there's a sorting going on to try and separate all of the cultural and political dimensions from the true understandings that religion should, or that are really important to that person. And that can offer, the next stage is called conjunctive faith, typified by perhaps a more ambivalent attitude to a lot of teachings and symbolism, perhaps a greater appreciation, again, of that there can be other ways of knowing, not just through rational thinking, but also through just reflection and reflective practices, and just being quiet, being still, and trying to really appreciate what's truly important. And so that is a very different from some of the scientific ways of approaching. It's internal reflection. And then stage 6 is called universalizing faith. Again, the author suggests that most people don't reach that stage in their lifetime. But it's kind of characterized by completely letting go of one's ego, and these people become transformers of culture, but it can sometimes also be seen as quite subversive. So, I think that one of the parallels between science and religion is that the scientific method teaches us, embedded in that is an idea that sometimes we have to let go of old ways of thinking, and if those old ways of thinking no longer sort of fit with our experience, and sometimes challenged, but it can be difficult to then take on a new way of thinking. We have to find for ourselves what those models are, what our understanding of reality is, what our understanding of religion is. So, I guess one of the classic areas where science and religion are often seen in contradiction to each other, where conflicts are created around the idea of sort of creationism versus evolution. And so, I'll put my cards on the table and say that I believe in the evolutionary kind of explanation of the complexity of life that we see in the world today. But it doesn't mean that I think Genesis doesn't have some truths within it. It's just that perhaps some of, in my interpretation, is that some of it is metaphorical, and some of it is, and was based on the understanding that was possible to give people at the time when it was written, but it also holds some deep sort of truths in the sense that creation is very good, it's an amazing gift from God, and therefore I guess that informs my approach to wanting to be involved in ecological restoration, and appreciating the sanctity of life. So I guess stop there. I mean, I can go in a lot more into how I think evolution works and how it uses random mutations to create very complex living things that work really well in their environment and are capable of doing amazing things. It takes a long time for those mutations to accumulate so that enough of the good mutations come together in one organism and it fits into its environment really well. And sexual reproduction is a means that actually helps one good mutation that arises in one individual to match up with a good mutation that arises in another individual, and their offspring can actually, some of their offspring will have the benefits of both good mutations in their makeup. And so these very rare events, which actually make something more complex but more better fitted to its environment, can be brought together through this process. And I guess the last note I've got to myself here is, so what do we mean by God? That's another very big question, and as a scientist, it's a challenging one. Again, do we believe, or do I believe in a God the Creator, God the Father, an interventionist God, that if I pray to him, he's going to temporarily change the laws of physics to create the outcome I want in a particular place? And I guess I have trouble believing in those versions of God. A definition that I come back to is perhaps one of the simplest ones, and that is simply that God is love. And to me, love is the ultimate emergent property of human society and of any sentient being. And as far as we know, we are the most advanced sentient beings in the universe, as far as we know. And that sentience and that ability to have empathy allows this property of love to emerge. And a lot of what's described about God still makes sense to me if you replace the word God with the word love. And that's, might be a subversive thing to say in a church, but I guess, I have to say what I believe. But love is still a very creative force, so it doesn't take away the fact that God can be a creator, and that God is good. Those things are both still true. Probably a good point to maybe take a question and then let the conversation continue. Thrown out a few different random things there. So.
Yeah, just to start you off, you did mention that the physics is mathematical, and mathematics does appear to be the language not only of the sciences but of the universe itself, to the extent that now we can digitise everything just by turning everything into numbers. Now, I've often asked the question, is mathematics a property of the universe itself? Is it something that is definitive of the universe, or is it something that is a creation, a construct of our minds? Now, obviously, I would suggest it is probably the former, that it is actually an innate property of the universe, and therefore then posits some kind of intelligence that is structured into the universe and the laws of physics in some way. And the way that mathematics clearly all fits everything together, and it does demonstrate that there is a real intelligence there right at the base of it. Just wondering if you'd comment on that from a philosophy of science point of view.
I would agree that I think mathematics does have some innate logic to it. The 1 + 1 = 2. I mean, we've given the symbols 1 and 2 to create those concepts, but you could symbolise it any other way and you'd still have 1 + 1 = 2. But just because that's true, I don't know if that is proof of a kind of intelligent design for a universe that is that way. I guess I didn't talk about, the science view of creation going back to the Big Bang. I guess when you get down to sort of maths and physics, I guess what I probably didn't say was that the language being used there is a very sort of basic, concrete language. Like you said, it's almost impossible to think that it couldn't exist any other way. But whether that can actually tell us anything about religion or some of those much higher levels in the sort of the grand chain about, I didn't actually go beyond. I sort of stopped at going from maths and physics to chemistry to biology to living things that maybe have a psychology, but then above that there's the concept of a soul and a spirit. And when you move, I guess, from a living thing to psychology, you're almost leaving the physical behind, because the language we use for psychology doesn't necessarily have to be rooted in anything physical. It's now starting to talk about just our thoughts. And we tend to think of our thoughts as just existing independent of anything physical. Then if you go into our souls or a spiritual realm, again, what's the connection between that and the physical world? I guess what I'm saying is that a lot of the physicists like Einstein who believed in God, but also worked on these deeply theoretical physics concepts, kind of said that the languages were just so different that physics and maths didn't disprove God or didn't prove God, that they were just perhaps talking at just such different levels.
On the contrary, I think that in psychology we have actually learned there is a chemistry of emotion.
Yeah.
Might hold that one. Okay. Give someone else a chance there, I think. Oh. Is that a question, John? Do you want to... I was just wondering with that last one around mathematics, I suppose, and going back to that Einstein quote about comprehensibility, I think underlying that is the suggestion that the incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible and it need not have been so. And that is then not a sort of suggestive sense that if there's a mathematical, given that there is a mathematical fabric to reality, that this is surprisingly congruent with our mental ability to conceive the world, and it need not have been so, and that is suggestive of something. I think that's sort of what Einstein's getting at. You're sort of not...
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would say our ability to comprehend the world is also partly because we've evolved to be fit to the world and therefore to comprehend the world as we experience it. But we're not very good at comprehending the world at the quantum level or at the really large scale where relativity comes into play, because it's so outside our everyday experience. And theoretical physicists have developed models at quantum levels and large sort of universal scales.
True, yeah.
But yeah, I guess if you take that mathematics could exist independent of any intelligent life form, it doesn't mean that a life form couldn't evolve to then understand mathematics.
Sure.
Yeah.
Next question. Who we got? Sir.
That's okay, Sir. I just want to ask you a brief, quick question. I'm just going to ask you a brief, quick question. Do you believe that, one, science answers how things work? The Old Testament, the New Testament, answers why things work. Is there something wrong with that? Or do you accept that as being true and correct? Science answers how, faith answers why.
Yeah. I would go along with that, to a large extent, that science is looking at the mechanistic understanding, but for those deep questions about what is the meaning of life, how should we relate to one another, religion is a much better language for exploring and understanding those questions.
Right, okay.
Yeah. And those questions have been around for thousands of years, and probably you could say religious understanding has been outstripping scientific understanding in some ways. Yeah.
Who's next?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm quite as far along as you are in terms of understanding your understanding of God, as you know, God is love. But well, not that I think God is love. But my question is, like you were talking about how love is like this emergent property of the universe. Do you also see somehow as love right at the beginning, spawning the universe in some way? How do you connect those two together?
Yeah, that one I just don't know. I mean, the science explanation of the Big Bang goes back to this point that they call a singularity, and then they just say at that point everything was so collapsed into one minute infinitesimal point of nothingness that you can't project beyond that to say what caused that. That's my understanding. There might be physicists that have gone beyond that. And I agree, it leaves empty that idea of whether there was a loving creator that actually caused the Big Bang in the first place. I mean, I would just say that my understanding of God, whatever God is surely imperfect. And so maybe I've limited God to a type of God that I can understand, and I'm quite happy to be proven wrong.
I wouldn't...
Or not prove. I mean, I don't think it's something you can prove anything. I'm quite happy for there to be different opinions on that.
Speaking of my own ignorance here again, Stephen, but might there be a sense in which, if love is at the beginning and love is at the end as well, that there is a kind of teleology to the evolutionary process that moves from love to love, I suppose? And I kind of have listened to a few lectures from our Cambridge paleontologist guy, Simon Cumming-Morris, who has this idea that if you look at the fossil record, that there is a kind of convergence that occurs in the evolutionary process, which suggests that it's not just kind of driven from behind, so to speak, but that it's being called into a kind of a future, almost in a sort of Platonic sense, that things are kind of going somewhere. It's not the random mutation, it's not a reality, but that the solutions that are reached in the evolutionary process happen in different places across the record, as if, there's a kind of calling forwards, and he doesn't, I think, completely spell out the kind of Platonic implications of it, but almost that God is at the other end of it, and that things like emergent properties like love are, they're where things are headed, and it's not boundless and purposeless in that sense. Does that ring any bells? Or does that
I'm familiar with that. I mean, there's been trends within evolution for increasing complexity. That's certainly true, and you get occasional transitions. Like when we moved from bacteria that had no nucleus to single cells called eukaryotes that had a nucleus and different organelles within them, which are actually this one cell subsuming other cells, and then those cells became part of the original cell. And then we had cells joining together to form multicellular organisms, and then multicellular organisms sometimes joining again with other species in a symbiosis way. And so there's been some trends towards higher complexity and higher diversity. And I think, was it, I can't remember his name, Samuel Morris?
Conway Morris,
was pointing out that of all the possible solutions that you could potentially imagine that evolution could take, it hasn't taken them all. It's taken certain pathways, and there's been some mass extinctions, and then sometimes similar solutions come up again, and sometimes even through different independent lineages the same solution is arrived upon. But I don't know if that means that they're being pulled towards that solution, or it's just that within the environment they're in and within the constraints of the biological systems that are reproducing, there are certain solutions which are more favourable. And if you keep exploring in a random manner, and then it's almost one of the analogies, I'll think of the name Richard Dawkins here, he used called climbing Mount Improbable. And so at the top of this mountain you've got this very unlikely solution, but if you're moving randomly, taking steps around this mountain, but if you're able to tell the difference between a step upwards and a step down, so you might roll a dice and half your offspring take a step up and half take a step down, but the ones that step up are more likely to survive than the ones that step down. Eventually, through that random process, you will eventually arrive near the top of the mountain. You know, there's probably multiple good solutions and multiple mountain peaks that evolution tends to climb towards. This is analogy. So just another quote that comes to mind, again, I don't have any solutions here, I'm still questioning things myself, is the idea that we are the universe made aware of itself. So we are made of the products of exploded stars and those chemicals, and it's still very mind-blowing. To me it doesn't undermine the grandeur of God, whether God was there at the beginning or God is there now.
So, as you've mentioned Richard Dawkins, let's talk a bit about that. Yeah. You've mentioned Einstein tried to hold together belief in God and being a physicist, and physicists either believe in God or they don't, but they tend to be fairly quiet about it. Yeah. Dawkins, who's an evolutionary biologist, is extremely public and vehement about his antagonism to religion. What do you think it is about your field, biology, that leads to somebody being so vehement about it?
I think it's probably that you can get scientific camps and religious camps, and they often end up characterizing the other camp without knowing much about it. And so I think Dawkins has a view of Christians, and I think he's particularly feels it's his mission to counteract those with a strong creationist belief, that sort of anti-evolution Christians. But there's equally many Christians who still call themselves Christians but still believe in evolution as a probable process. So I'm not sure that he knows that much about Christianity. I don't know why. I mean, I've read some of his books and I find he's got some really good ideas in them, but his more recent sort of television documentaries and stuff, so on, I find him really unnecessarily arrogant and aggressive.
Hello, Stephen. I'm Chris, and I was one of your undergrad students in an ecology class a few years ago. It's nice to hear you lecture again.
Yeah.
My question is sort of about something that I think is usually called the anthropic principle, and maybe it ties into some of the convergent evolution concepts as well. But as I understand it, the anthropic principle is the idea that, well, it poses a question, and it's kind of, given that we're here observing the universe and we're able to comprehend it, like Einstein sort of mentioned, is that remarkable or not? You could say, well, we just evolved according to the environment that we were in, and it was useful for us in that case to be observant about features around us and, you know, the sort of building blocks that gave us the scientific method and so on. And therefore it's not that remarkable that we're here observing the universe, because we wouldn't be doing it unless the universe is already here. So it's kind of a sort of non-remarkable thing. We're here because we're here, sort of thing. But then the other way you can take it is sticking with the whole, well, isn't it cool that we can see all of this and we can understand this? And it doesn't seem to necessarily be a scientific or a philosophical question, but more maybe one about sentiment or faith. You know, is it interesting that we're here, or is it just kind of self-evident that we're here? And then you could sort of look at the convergent evolution thing and say, well, is it interesting that we're on top of this, you know, Dawkins' mountain of human intellectual capacity and being able to practice science and things? Or, and is it interesting that, you know, various species have all developed in convergent ways, or is it kind of just self-evident? So I don't know if that makes sense, but do you think that that's an interesting question, or one that's kind of a bit of a distraction or irrelevant, or is it one that more people should maybe ask themselves? What do you think?
I mean, my approach, my answer to that challenge is that I think it's amazing that we're here and that there's the diversity of life, and that probably is why I got interested in biology and ecology. But whether you could say, oh, it was just a statistical, almost inevitability that somewhere in the universe something like us would evolve and emerge. Does that make us less interesting? I don't think so. I mean, we're all, yeah, there's 8 billion humans, but we all are very interested in ourselves individually. We can't get to know every of the other 799,000 million people around, but we are the only living planet that we know of with life on it, and so I think, and we are part of that, so for that reason I'm very interested in ourselves and our place on this planet. And I think both scientific and religious practices can teach us about that.
John.
So Stephen, I have two questions. One of them probably more fundamental than the other. But you said you didn't find the, if you like, the traditional idea of God as presumably a transcendent being with certain characteristics that, if you like, traditional theists would associate with such a God, namely omnipotence and omnipresence and all the others that are often suggested. You didn't find that notion of God very plausible or convincing. I can't remember the precise word you used.
I found it difficult.
You find it difficult?
Yeah.
Yes. So my question is why? What is it that you don't? What is it that's difficult about that, and that leads you to reject it, or at least to be highly sceptical?
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess I'm ambivalent about it. I agree with God as being something transcendent, sort of above and beyond any individual, and that somehow, but is connected to the whole collection of individuals that are here on Earth. It's the bit that I find really difficult is the interventionist characterization of a God, because I don't think I've experienced it myself, or maybe I have without knowing it. And so I guess it's based on an empiricism. Now, it doesn't mean, the counter-argument to that is there's lots of things I do believe I haven't experienced myself, but I take it on the word of others, both science and religious-wise.
So some philosophers of religion, and I'm thinking here of a number of people, would take the view that one of the grounds for believing in God is the very widespread experience that people have of something transcendent, something that encounters them. So there's, the religious experience, in other words, is a very widespread human phenomenon across multiple civilizations and cultures and over very long periods of time. And people might also point to quite specific events that appear to have the characteristics of a miracle, of which in Christian terms the resurrection of Jesus would be perhaps the most significant one.
Yes, so
I suppose my question is, as a scientist looking at evidence, what do you have to say in response to the very widespread evidence that appears to be there of people experiencing something that they would regard as God?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that transcendent experience, that God is something that can be related to that transcendent experience that you're referring to. Again, the closest analogy I can come to is love. I mean, I feel I've experienced what it is to fall in love. And that's something that's very hard to put in words, but I still feel it's something that's real. God is something that's very hard to put into words. So, in a sense, I feel God is real, but I'm not quite sure what it is, or he or she is. So I'm struggling, with a definition of God. But open to the idea that there is something transcendent that we can call God, and it's worth talking about.
Hi, I really liked your critique of reductionisms, and I thought you did it really well. So it was, and I'm in psychology, so that fits in pretty well with that. I think the way the data point. So thank you for that. Just in terms of interventionism and the idea that an interventionist God may require a God who violates the rules of physics. I'm wondering if that is so. Like when we intervene as humans, if we treat ourselves as agents rather than machines, when a doctor cures someone, we help someone, we don't see that as interfering with the rules of physics. So if we see God as an agent, if God helps someone or cures someone, doesn't necessarily involve contravening the laws, so-called laws of physics. I realise they can be questioned and so on. We learn more about physics and the laws do clarify based on things that happen. But I just wasn't sure on that suggestion you made.
Yeah, I guess, I was thinking more about how does prayer work. I believe that God can be found in people, and people through their acts do the work of God. So again, God could be healing in that way. It's perhaps the idea that there can be a sort of metaphysical signal sent. That's the sort of the style of God's actions that I found quite harder.
I wanted to go back. Is that working? Okay. I wanted to go back to something you said a while ago, which is a bit complicated because a lot's been said since, but you mentioned just in a phrase, limiting God, and then of course you talked about reductionism, and I wondered if that's the problem that we have today, is that we do try to reduce God to something that seems comprehensible in terms of what science is telling us. And yet for me the exciting part of science is that it's reaching into all kinds of new areas. It's resisting reductionism, things like consciousness studies are sort of saying, this is a whole new area, we need new forms of understanding. This is coming out of science. So I wonder about turning it around and saying, can we find that in the way we do our theology and our biblical interpretation? Because the Bible to me seems to resist reducing God to just love, it's a huge part of it, but we have God as an eagle, a lion, a rock, a lamb, in a fire, and then of course in human form. So I just wondered if you thought we could not limit God and that science, we'd be excited by science, but also take that into our idea of God and not constrain God.
Yes, it was more a kind of a self-reflection and characterisation of myself that I feel relative to other people I'm probably limiting God more than others do. And that might be something that I grow not to do. I don't know if does that help answer your question? Yeah. I agree both. The exciting part of science is trying to reach out into the unknown and to create better understanding. And I guess I try to convey where I find myself right now on my journey of faith, but who knows where it's going to go in the future. And sometimes things go around in circles.
It was interesting the comment that was made a minute ago about changing the laws of physics to suit your needs on a day-to-day basis, but I'd comment that you probably can find many examples in nature of things that are so unlikely that you could take those as being a view that there is a transcendent being. So, as an example, something like the property of a substance like water, and the way in which it just happens to be lighter in a solid state than its liquid state. Very, very uncommon in a chemical property set. But anyway, that wasn't going to be my question. My question was really about the original topic of this evening. I think it was around whether or not science and religion can coexist, or whether they could effectively coexist. And I guess there's lots of examples throughout history where you could quite clearly argue that religion has hindered scientific development, and there's probably a reasonable number of examples where science has been detrimental to religion. And I'm probably thinking about the Middle Ages in most senses, but do you think on a day-to-day basis in this day and age that religion and science effectively coexist in a society like ours?
I mean, I think with greater tolerance, then the two do coexist, and I think we probably have moved over the last few hundred years to a greater, in some way, well, in some respects, there's been a greater tolerance. In some cases, there's been a kind of a broadening of the view of both science and of religion, and in other cases, there's just been a moving apart and maybe just a blinkered view. Well, I'll just carry on in my way of thinking and won't worry about trying to square it with the other way of thinking, and so you can. That's another way of coexisting, of just compartmentalising the two. So I guess I've argued that there is a bit of compartmentalisation, because they are speaking often at different levels about different types of meaning, mechanistic or some of the most deeper questions of life. But I guess whether you feel that there can be, I think, personal conflicts when the two don't marry up, but there's kind of the way society is operating, at least within kind of New Zealand society. I mean, there is religious freedom, there's definitely declining numbers of churchgoers, so whether you see that as coexistence or not, I don't know, but at least on paper there's supposedly coexistence is allowed, but people are sometimes choosing for themselves.
We've got time for a couple more questions as we've seen you send it here.
Hi. One thing that I've been struggling with a lot, personally, but also in interacting with my non-religious friends, is the relationship between natural theology and special revelation, so the Bible. I've kind of, like you, evolved a lot in my faith. And in that sense, I've struggled to see how the Bible is literally the words of God. So I see it more as a reflection of humans' experiences, and, until you get at a climax of Jesus, sort of like a full image, a full kind of expression of divinity. But the reason why in saying that, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. So my question is, what place do you think natural theology... So natural theology is using natural arguments of, philosophical arguments to do with, like, fine-tuning, which the guy at the back mentioned with the anthropic principle. And there's other common philosophical arguments which are used as well. But, like, when you relate that to the Bible, like, in what sense do you think Christians can make it plausible or credible? Because one tension, you said that you're ambivalent about your definition of God, right? If we go with, because in the Bible there seems to be this tension between free will and God's sovereignty, right? It doesn't seem to be resolved. But I've noticed that a lot of agnostic Christian types like yourself, that they will often opt to pick one or the other, so that they'll often, try to relieve or, try to resolve that contradiction somehow. That's probably one aspect of the definition of God, which you probably struggle with, I assume. So my question is just, how can we use the Bible as agnostic or unsure Christians in a way that's sort of plausible and credible without being unfaithful to the text, but also not being losing a witness, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, a lot of good sermons I've heard will often start off by giving the historical context of when a particular book was written and what was going on to help put it in its historical and political context. And I think that can help to deepen the understanding of what it's saying. And then I would sort of try and think maybe, well, what's the deeper message in this piece of reading of scripture that it can tell us. So, yeah, particularly the passages which can be difficult to take literally and to square those with a scientific understanding, there can still be a deep message of truth behind that. We can refer to the fact that Jesus used so many parables. So, yeah, I mean, I guess the short answer is the kind of the high use of metaphor or just looking for deeper messages. Yeah.
I see 3 more questions. We have 3 more. That's enough.
I'm glad there's lots of questions.
Stephen, thank you very much. Just one more question on the evolution. So if we consider the ecological systems of Earth with humankind removed, then we can see that any ecological system has benefited from the effects of evolution. It evolved into something better, and it's never led to destruction. If we now consider the humankind as the product of the evolution, what was the point for the nature to evolve the humankind?
I think the short answer to that is that evolution has no point or foresight. It just creates things, and sometimes there have been organisms that were very devastating to those around them, and there have been other waves of extinction. And sometimes those causes can be linked to things like an asteroid or the change in the way the continents were arranged, and so the climate changed. And so sometimes species have taken over and dominated, but then usually something brings them down, and then other species flourish and take its place. And so gradually the trend has been for increasing diversity and increasing complexity, but there's been at least 5 big crashes, and there's been lots of little crashes along the way. And it looks like humans are responsible for what's called the 6th mass extinction. And so we're dominating because we can. You could link it back to the selfish gene concept that, yeah, it's survival of the fittest, and if the fittest are leaving the most offspring, and those offspring are using resources better and quicker than anything else can, then certain resources are finite, and they can only go around so far, and if one organism is dominating, then it's going to be at the expense of others.
Hi, Stephen. What I've come away with from a lot of this is science and religion talking past each other or talking in different languages. And what I'd really like to go away with is some commonality, even if it's a bit simplistic. So what can you say are the two, what's the nexus? What's the way science and religion can talk to each other? You mentioned a definition of science as reaching out into the unknown for better understanding, and I think that would also match what our religious gene encourages us to do. So would you agree, and would that be an oversimplistic way of summing it up, finding a common ground?
Yes, I may have portrayed a slightly negative discussion, but I agree, both religion and science are trying to understand ultimate truths, and I think they approach it from different angles, but there might be a sense that even coming from different angles, there will be a point at which they overlap and meet. Yeah, I mean, the other scientific, you could study religions in a scientific way and then do comparative studies of all the different big world religions and look at what are the common strands between them, and maybe that's again something that's transcendent and universal of both humans and creation in that sense. Does that help at all? Yeah.
I just want simpler.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Sometimes there's no comfortable, easy answers in this.
Hi, just thinking about that previous question, it seems to me that fundamentalism is a challenge to all of us, whether it's fundamentalist religious people or fundamentalist scientists who insist this is my view and everybody has to agree with me. That, I think, is part of the big barrier all over the place.
Yes, I'd agree.
As our scientific and mathematical understanding of the universe become more in depth and our theories about how the universe works become more plausible, do you feel that religion becomes either less relevant or sort of it diminishes its power that it has in our society?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that's something that different people might feel differently about. For some people, they'll feel satisfied with the scientific answers, but I think on the whole, the scientific answers don't usurp the religious understanding either, and the religious approach.
Last one.
Hi Stephen, everyone. I'm a researcher of a social science, actually a PhD of applied linguistics. What brought me here was I've been reading a book about development of statistics, and so how statistics revolutionized science. That book called Lady Tasting Tea. On the book cover it says, "Statistics, the tool that we use to measure God's idea." That's very interesting to me, and that's something that brings me to this workshop. The talk. Sorry. I'm not really familiar with Christianity. I'm more familiar with Buddhism, but I think religion and the relation between this religion and science are something of is the same for any religion, not just Christianity. And from that book, I got an idea that there is a very thin line between science and religion. Because what we are doing, not just scientists, social scientists also trying to using hypothesis and testing hypothesis to get a better idea of the world, of our behavior, our mentality. In a way that we're trying to test something that's the truth that we've been seeking, and the truth we can say that is from the God, that in a way. I also found that how the statistics develop comes from the idea that we want to test Darwin's evolution theories. And no matter how hard we're trying to do the scientific research, we always find limitations, because as a human being, our existence in the long existence of the universe is quite limited, and we're trying our best to find out how we exist and why we exist. But there are certain limits. I think that's something called time. It's not just statistics that's the tool that measures God's will or God's idea. I think it's the time. And because of our limited existence on this earth, we're just trying our best using science to understand our being here. But religion is something that scientific studies might not really explain, but I think it coexists quite well with each other. And it's something that helps us both better understand ourselves, the world, our relationship between each other, and our being in this universe. Anyway, this is just my idea that I want to talk about.
Thank you. Anything to say to that, Stephen?
I did, and now it's just gone out of my mind, but thank you for that. What was I going to say? I think it's repeating the earlier point that both science and religion are trying to understand our place in this world, and I think people should practice both. And I also have a lot of tolerance for all the different great religions.
Thanks, Stephen. It really struck me wandering around the audience tonight, just how many of you are taking notes. It's really striking. I don't think any of the other spring series had as many note takers as this one, and that just shows to me, I guess, what's at stake here and just the importance of wrestling with this stuff and thinking it through. We have heard 101 different opinions this evening, and we will continue hopefully to have 102 over another cup of tea out the back. So thank you, Stephen, for provoking our thinking and getting us going on that. The last couple of questions really got me thinking about, and your answers about what endures in this stuff, and I guess people will keep praying, won't they? That's saying there are no atheists in foxholes. And so I'm going to finish with a prayer, which comes from our Anglican New Zealand prayer book, and sort of picks up some of these themes, and I think points us to the importance of living ethically in the light of our knowledge of our place in the world and the gift that it is for us. Let's pray. Blessed are you, God of growth and discovery. Yours is the inspiration that has altered and changed our lives. Yours is the power that has brought us to new dangers and opportunities. Set us, your new creation, to walk through this new world, watching and learning, loving and trusting, until your kingdom comes. In Christ's name, amen. Let's give Stephen a round of applause. In 2 weeks' time, we're back on deck, and actually our speaker for 2 weeks is actually hiding in the audience with a fake moustache and a rose in his lapel, and that's Professor Neil Dodgson, and he's going to be talking about the future of humanity and robotics and AI and all that kind of stuff, and whether we need to be afraid. Well, that's what I'm taking a look at. Neil, I don't know if it's what we're going to talk about or not, but that's what I want to hear about. So come along in 2 weeks' time for that event, and we look forward to that one then. Please do stick around, ask Stephen more questions, ask each other more questions, have another glass of wine, another cup of tea, and see you all in 2 weeks.